officials in the United States on the subject of annexation. A notable lack of passion either way on the issue has been felt from the White House. Now, opponents of Prime Minister Netanyahu's plans have seemingly hoped in vain that President Trump would order a halt to the idea, while at the same time, supporters of the unilateral move have struggled to find that clear voice in the administration on their side of the subject. Now, to get more into this angle of the issue, now we're joined now to get some more insight on the United States and how they factor in here. We're joined by Matthew Brooks. He's the executive director of the Republican Jewish Coalition, and Jeremy Ben-Ami, the president of J Street, the Democratic-leaning Israel policy group, both in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us here, gentlemen. Before we get into the discussion, though, I do want to introduce one other relevant topic here, that there's a draft letter now being circulated by the progressive Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as Bernie Sanders now added his name to a dozen other signatories there. Now, that letter warns that, quote, should the Israeli government move forward with the planned annexation with this administration's acquiescence, we'll work to ensure non-recognition as well as pursue conditions on the $3.8 billion in U.S. military funding to Israel, close quote. Now, again, back with our panel here. First of all, I want to start with you, Jeremy, here, and talk about this letter going around circulated by Representative Ocasio-Cortez looking to condition defense aid to Israel over potential annexation. It's an idea that's so far held at arm's length by the vast bulk of the Democratic Party, but I want to get your thoughts on that initiative.
Sure. Well, I think that the more relevant letter to discuss is actually the letter that was sent from 191 members of Congress. I know that the other letter you've mentioned is sort of top of mind, but it may get a dozen signatures. The other letter led by Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky and Ted Deutsch and Brad Schneider and David Price actually speaks for where I think the wall-to-wall Democratic Party is at, which is that the party believes very deeply in a friendship with the state of Israel and supports the security of the state of Israel. 191 is nearly unanimous within the caucus, and that unanimity is reflected as well in a deep opposition to the concept of annexation. Annexation undercuts Israel's security, as the commanders for Israel's security have said. It undercuts its democratic nature. It will have a tremendously destabilizing impact on the Palestinian Authority, on the neighbors, the relations with Jordan, and I do think that it will rupture the kind of relationship that the state of Israel is looking for with its global partners. You've already seen states like Belgium and the Netherlands, I think, today, talk about what impact annexation would have on Israel's relations with countries around the world. So I think the 191 member letter expressing pretty much unanimous opposition to this idea from the Democratic Party. And it echoes, by the way, nearly 40 Democratic senators who sent similar letters either together or separately expressing their opposition as well.
Matthew, I want to bring in obviously the Republican side here. It's felt, certainly under this administration, that the Republican Party supports really all things Israel. Is this issue pushing the limits of that?
No, not at all. In fact, we can talk about dueling letters. Jeremy organized the letter that he mentioned on his side of the aisle with the Democrats. We were instrumental in working on a similar letter led by Republican leader Kevin McCarthy and the entire leadership of the House, close to 150 signatories on that. Coming out in full support of the Prime Minister and the democratically elected government of Israel to make decisions that are in their own sovereign interest. It seems to me that, it's sort of like Groundhog Day with Jeremy and the opponents of, these kind of things, because, no matter what the issue, whether it's ending the Iran deal, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognition of Jerusalem, support for the annexation of the Golan Heights. All of these things have been predicted with the same kind of doom and gloom that Jeremy is talking about. It's going to fracture and rupture the relations with the international community. It's going to ostracize Israel. There's going to be rioting in the streets, and the streets are going to be aflame, and we'll never be able to get back from this. And none of that has happened. And I will tell you that if we do move forward with annexation, those same fears that have been tried to be promoted won't materialize again. And sure, if you want to talk about Belgium or Netherlands, they never support Israel to begin with. So there's no big loss there. But the reality is, if you go back, this is stuff we've all heard time and time again, and it's been proven wrong and wrong every time.
Jeremy, I want to come back to you, maybe on a slightly more pointed point here, but your organization that promotes policy positions that aim to put outside pressure on Israel in order to affect its actions through the U.S. government specifically. But do you disagree with the largely held concept in Washington, reiterated recently by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, that Israel is a strong democracy with a voting electorate that can decide on its own policies and borders?
No, look, this is a moment of choice for Israel. And Israel is a democracy for those who are its citizens, and those citizens elect a government, and the government can decide what it wants to do. But when you get to a fork in the road, you have a choice. The choice for the state of Israel right now is, on the one hand, continue down a path of perpetual occupation, perpetual settlement expansion, perhaps some limited annexation now, and ongoing creeping annexation of the entirety of the land. And the democratic nature of the state will be eroded, and its standing around the world is going to be diminished. And the relationship between American Jews and the state of Israel, other than the 20% or so support the Republican Party, is going to disappear over time. That's a choice that a democratic state can make to go down that path. There is another path. The other path is a path that says, we're 14 million people that live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and there's two peoples here. They both have rights. They both have a right to national self-determination, and they each need their national homeland. And we need to separate. We need to have two states for two people and regional peace. There's an Arab peace initiative waiting to be entered. It's not called the Trump vision. That is not a plan for peace. There's an Arab peace initiative, which is a plan for peace. And that means ending occupation. It means ending settlement expansion. And that's a choice, and it's up to the government of Israel. What J Street does is we lobby for what the American foreign policy should be. We don't lobby what Israel's foreign policy should be. The American foreign policy should be to promote America's interests and America's values, and the kinds of steps that Prime Minister Netanyahu is looking potentially to take with the support of Ambassador David Friedman and some others in the White House, and with Matt and his group's support. Those are not the kinds of policies that are supported by the overwhelming majority of Jewish Americans. They're not supported by nearly unanimous vision of the Democratic Party. They're not supported by the European Union. They're not supported by the United Nations. Matt, if you are satisfied by a state of Israel that lives with support from the minority party in one country in the world, and that's it, and the rest of the world opposes what's happening, and the majority of this country opposes it, that's a choice that the state of Israel is entitled to make. I think it's a very, very sad choice.
Matt, I want to get Matt's perspective on this. Certainly, is basically the question being posed, but I want to frame it in this regard too, Matt. That President Trump, obviously, a lot's been made about where he stands on this issue here, along with the party. Do you think he's upset to see his detailed peace plan reduced to Israeli unilateral action?
No, I don't think so at all. I think that was one cornerstone of the Trump plan for peace. And, this move will be a furtherance of the steps that were outlined when the plan was released. Look, Jeremy is right. There is a stark contrast between the political parties in America today as it relates to Israel. The notion that we have a bipartisan consensus as it relates to Israel no longer exists. There is one pro-Israel party. It's the Republican Party. President Trump is the most pro-Israel president in history. And the choice has not been made by the Israeli government about annexation. And this is a fundamental difference between the perspective that I have and Jeremy has. It was made by the citizens of the state of Israel. There were 4 elections. It was very clear where Prime Minister Netanyahu stood on the issue of expanding Israel's sovereignty into Judea and Samaria and into the Jordan Valley. They have a unity government. There is support between Benny Gantz and the Prime Minister, and strong bipartisan support for this move. So the notion that this is somehow a careless or reckless effort undertaken by the government, it reflects the will of the democratically elected government of the state of Israel. And we fully support that, as Jeremy should, rather than helping to encourage people to oppose the government of Israel, who was elected by its citizens, our most democratic ally in the region. We should be supporting them.
Jeremy, coming back to you here, there's a lot's been made about Israel losing the support or the backing of the Democratic Party at large, or at least the situation trending in that direction here. That's happened under Prime Minister Netanyahu's watch, and there's been a lot of open animosity between the top Democratic leaders, even in the Prime Minister. Do you think that there's a different attitude or perspective towards Benny Gantz as potentially the next Prime Minister?
Yeah, I mean, I put a lot of this on Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think that the, goes back to the Iran nuclear agreement that Matt mentioned earlier. When the Prime Minister of Israel came to the United States and tried to tell the United States what to do, and came to the Congress and spoke behind the back of the sitting President of the United States, invited in 2012 Mitt Romney for a campaign appearance in Israel, when he was running against the sitting President of the United States. I think those are the kinds of steps that began this break in the bipartisan nature of the way Israel was related to as an issue in American politics. It's very sad what's happened to the Republican Party, Matt. I'm really sorry to see what has happened. I have deep respect for the Bush family, for George H.W. Bush, for George W., for Condoleezza Rice, for James Baker, for the true diplomats that are the heritage of the Republican Party that I grew up with, that promoted diplomacy and promoted peace and recognized that resolving this conflict in two states for two people was in America's national interest. That was when we had a bipartisan policy. It was a policy that was backed by the presidents of both parties for
Jeremy,
over 2 decades.
I want to get. We have 1 minute left here. I'm sorry. I want to get Matt's perspective too, just to end this in. Matt, any responses to this, and perhaps in short, where is this going?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice that Jeremy now says how much he appreciated George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. Meanwhile, when they were in power, he didn't support a single thing that they ever did. So the reality is. The reality is that, as we've talked about before, this exchange between the two of us provides a microcosm of what's happening in the larger context of the Republicans and the Democrats. And as I said before, and I'll leave you with this, there is only one pro-Israel party. There is only one party who is prepared and willing to stand by the democratically elected government of Israel and respect their sovereign rights.
Thank you. Both were out of time, unfortunately. Matthew Brooks, Jeremy Ben-Ami, appreciate you guys bringing